It's so nice here, and it's such an extraordinary gathering of
In
key
your
people.
world, is it?
Yes,
Okay.
it's pretty extraordinary. I hold an annual conference every year that started just when this started, and I call it the Atrocity Crimes Litigation Year in Review Conference. And the object is to look at the immediately preceding year of litigation in the tribunals and have the prosecutors, defense counsel, sometimes registrar, sometimes a judge, all on the same panel. And for a day, I pepper them with questions just like Michael Scharf did today. And so we do that once a year at Northwestern. I changed the game a little bit earlier this year because I convened the conference in The Hague as opposed to Chicago, which saved me a lot of money. And thanks to video and everything, we videoed it and put it on the website, and the students could see it at their leisure. And the only setback was I couldn't have my students literally in the room with me, and that is a setback. But in terms of cost, it made all the difference in the world, because most of them are in The Hague.
Right. Well, and we find that in our case too. It's worked out so far, but nevertheless, it's flights and.
Oh yeah. And here's the great irony. You're essentially in an NGO world. So much money is raised by NGOs in order to pay airline companies and hotels. In other words, it's a vicious cycle. You're raising all this money. It's to pay these corporate entities. Isn't it just outrageous?
And what we're trying to do, the world to me is loaded with people who have credit cards, and on the credit cards are earned miles.
Yeah.
And I believe in my heart of hearts we can tap into that, because to them that's found money, yet it's real for us. And so the campaign was this year and will be next year is figuring out how to easily, have the donor easily transfer those miles to us so we can use them.
Ah, yes, of course.
And that seems simple until you get into practice, but
Yeah.
I think I broke the code here a few weeks ago that will permit it happen. And who knows?
Well,
But
good luck.
Yeah, I think. What's Nuremberg mean to David Scheffer? I mean, you've been so involved with the International Criminal Court, being the ambassador of war crimes, being involved with the various tribunals that we talked about today. But going back to the beginning, Nuremberg trials.
It's the stamp of legitimacy for all that we have done ever since. In other words, when we got started in the 1990s on building the modern war crimes tribunals, we had to have some historical validation for what we were doing, and Nuremberg provides that validation.
Mm-hmm.
It was the original foundational template for what was undertaken in the 1990s. If we had not had Nuremberg, it would have been a far more controversial and difficult process to build an international criminal tribunal system, for the 1990s. So it to me is it's the historical validation of what had to follow it many decades later.
Mm-hmm. As you've been so involved with the policy aspect of it, have you spent much time looking at the individual Robert Jackson, who certainly as part of the Nuremberg process got involved in the architecture of how the trial would actually be set up?
Absolutely. I mean, I know of him through reading about him in various books, including The Anatomy of the Nuremberg Trials, and just most recently Noah Feldman's The Scorpions, which has some very interesting chapters about Jackson in that book. But Jackson, back in the 1990s, I had read about him in various books and certainly understood the significance that he brought to the entire endeavor. Quite frankly, beyond the law itself, which of course he made a tremendous contribution on, particularly crimes against peace, the law of aggression, which was the centerpiece of his prosecution in Nuremberg. What Robert Jackson brought to the endeavor was a spirit of commitment and of enthusiasm for the ideal of international justice. He was so eloquent. You know, sometimes in history you have to have individuals who speak so eloquently that almost regardless of what they actually achieve, the eloquence of how they seek that goal reverberates through the generations. It was true of Robert Jackson, it was true of Martin Luther King, it was true of Jack Kennedy. Now, all of those individuals accomplished things, but I think one of their lasting contributions to later generations was the eloquence with which they presented the mandate they were pursuing, and that was definitely Robert Jackson.
You wrote this, I found, very fascinating book, All the Missing Souls, A Personal History of the War Crimes Tribunal. What motivated you to do this, to kind of memorialize your life's journey?
You know, as I was ending my 8 years with the Clinton administration on essentially the war crimes beat, it became increasingly apparent to me that I needed to record the history of what was transpiring on my watch. I had kept throughout all those 8 years meticulous notebooks, in part because I always have to be briefing and speaking with other officials about what I have just learned or recorded, etc. So you need to have the record in front of you in order to properly brief your colleagues, speak to other governments, etc. All that ended up in my notebooks. And so I knew that I had a very rich body of, shall we say, evidence to draw upon, which was really found nowhere else. And as I looked at those boxes of notebooks, I said to myself, it's absolutely foolish not to create some kind of historical record from this. It's very, very important, particularly as I was reading what other people were writing about the war crimes tribunals and recognizing that they were missing huge parts of the story, that it was very, very important to actually, for history, get this down. And to do so not really as a memoir, but rather, as I say, as a personal history. In other words, I was witness to, but also a participant in, a large historical movement of international justice for 8 years. It's extremely important that that not be lost that it be part of the historical record.
You majored in international criminal law. Did you think you'd get yourself into the public policy side of this? How did that happen? What was the jump?
Well, actually, I really focused on international law per se in law school, not international criminal law, but I took courses on the laws of war and things of that nature, but I really saw myself coming out of law school as hopefully a very young international lawyer. But I waited for, I waded for 8 years into an international practice that was all private law, international transactions. So I really was not in the public law realm until about 9 years into my career, when I made this big jump from private law down to Washington and started working on Capitol Hill as a lawyer for the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And that catapulted me into public law, which is what I had always wanted to do. I'd finally sort of met my dream and started it. I didn't know where it would end up, but circumstances so unfolded in Washington that I ultimately found myself in the Clinton campaign for the presidency, and then having the extremely fortunate opportunity to be the first staffer working for Madeleine Albright, who was our new ambassador to the UN. And it just so happened that the first month of her tour, in January, February of 1993, was the month in which the Balkans and the atrocities in the Balkans came to a focused a point of attention within the Security Council, and Madeleine Albright took the lead to actually consider and then initiate the creation of a war crimes tribunal. So being right at her side was, of course, the opportunity that launched my immersion for 8 years.
Was there a moment in time where she sort of turned to you and said, "David, do you want to take this on?"
Yeah, I mean, basically in the first week or two, she said, "Look, we've got to have." I was in the Washington office of the ambassador at that time in the State Department, because she had a State Department office too, and I was taking on the National Security Council duties for her on the Deputies Committee, so I had to be in Washington for that. But she basically said to me, you know, we're going to have to run this issue in Washington, and you need to be my point man to do that. And so it, you know, it sort of gravitated to that point of mandate in my work to work the issue of accountability almost really on a daily basis.
I mean, there's a learning curve here. I mean, there's no,
Yes.
other than Nuremberg, there was no template.
That's right. I mean, we were immersed at that particular moment in the work of the International Law Commission of the United Nations, which was looking at a statute for a permanent international criminal court. So on behalf of Ambassador Albright, I got immersed in looking at what the International Law Commission was doing. But you know, events were sort of forcing us into the arena, because shortly after the Balkans in 1994, of course, we had the genocide in Rwanda. Mm-hmm. So things multiplied quite rapidly in those early 2 to 3 years that I got deeply involved in the process.
Were other nations similarly? Did they have a David Scheffer? The Britons?
Technically, no, but ultimately, after I became ambassador at large for war crimes issues, and it was the only such ambassadorship in the world, and still is, mm-hmm. here in the United States, other countries began to designate envoys as envoys with special responsibility for war crimes or for the negotiations on the International Criminal Court, or for war crimes in the Balkans, for example. And I began to know of the individuals in foreign governments with whom I should be in direct contact with as often as possible, mm-hmm. because they were really my links. But oftentimes it was a very haphazard exercise. Who within the foreign ministry should I be connecting with on this issue? Who within the Prime Minister's office should I be connecting with on this issue? And it was a search and identify mission almost every time. Yeah. So it was a very almost innovative exercise of which government official should I probably try to press my points on in order to make the greatest influence on this issue with this foreign government, as opposed to there being a counterpart. I mean, if you're Secretary of State, you know that you have the Foreign Minister to talk mm-hmm. to. If you're the Secretary of Defense, you know that you have the Defense Minister to talk to. There was no war crimes ambassador literally for me to talk to on the other side of the table. So I had to try to identify the right person who would be relevant for the issue.
Did Madeleine Albright give you a lot of discretion?
Oh, a considerable amount, yes. But you know, she was a tremendous person to work for, very inspirational, a very hard taskmaster. She was always very focused on getting the details right, mm-hmm. And you know, you work under instruction mm-hmm. as an ambassador, and she certainly did what was normal for any Secretary of State when you know she has an ambassador at large or an ambassador. Clearly, you work within broad parameters of instructions. But quite frankly, the only way to get certain things done is while you're working within those broad parameters, you have to be imaginative enough to figure out, well, how can I press the envelope in this direction or this direction or this direction, bring it back to Washington and get final approval for it. But in the meantime, I'm out in the field and I've got to push the envelope here. And that's always a very tactful exercise because you are representing the United States of America as an ambassador. So you're not literally out there on your own. You're actually out there representing more than 300 million people. And you always have to keep that in mind in terms of everything that you do in the field, that it's not just your show. You're out there representing an entire nation. So be careful as you tread.
You've worked on the ad hoc tribunals for Yugoslavia, Rwanda, the hybrid tribunal for Sierra Leone, and then through this process, timing is not absolutely correct, but the idea of a permanent court comes into play. What's the genesis of that? I mean, I realize there's some historical basis for it, but at some point, was it the United Nations that initiated that?
Well, more or less. Actually, it was really initiated in its modern iteration in 1989 by the president of Trinidad and Tobago, President Robinson, who wanted to have a permanent international criminal court to investigate and prosecute drug trafficking cartels because it was putting too much pressure on the courts of Trinidad and Tobago to deal with cartels. And of course there was a lot of drug trafficking going through Trinidad and Tobago. So he wanted to have an international court which could lift this burden from Trinidad and Tobago. So he started to press the idea. It then evolved and morphed by the time of the atrocities of the early 1990s, whereby what was occurring in the Balkans in particular, and then in Rwanda, were crimes of quite different character: genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes. And nations were becoming very reticent about there being an international court for drug trafficking. The intelligence on drug trafficking is very sensitive. Nations, particularly the United States, want to keep that close hold. And furthermore, we have multilateral drug trafficking conventions that basically follow the principle of prosecute or extradite. If you can't do it in Trinidad and Tobago, hey, extradite it to the guy to Miami. We'll take care of him.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was not as much of an interest in upsetting that apple cart. But on the larger or alternative atrocity crimes of genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes, there was a growing need. And after the Security Council created the Yugoslav Tribunal and the Rwanda Tribunal in 1993 and 1994, that was a pretty big effort for the Security Council. You can't just keep going back to the Security Council and keep saying, well, create yet another such tribunal under your authority, and you pay for it to the Security Council or the member states of the UN. So that tribunal fatigue finally, I think, convinced a lot of people that the ongoing talks in the International Law Commission for a permanent court had merit. And in 1995, the draft that was produced by the International Law Commission then was opened up for intergovernmental discussions. And then 3.5 years later, it was really warp speed in treaty negotiations. 3.5 years later, the treaty is finalized in Rome.
The International Law Commission, which we had the report in 1995, we were part of that? Somebody from the United States was a representative?
The report was released in late '94, and it has a number of independent experts. One of them was from the United States, Robert Rosenstock, and he happened to be also the legal counsel for the U.S. mission to the UN at the time. So he was double hatting, but of course when he sat on the commission he was independent. But he was someone we could talk to very directly. He knew what the interests of the United States were in the process. He didn't always follow them, by the way. He was independent when he sat on that commission. But that was our role, was to work with Rosenstock in terms of what is the final output of the International Law Commission. And while some of it was satisfactory to the Obama administration, some of it was questionable as to what the International Law Commission had produced. And
You mean the Clinton administration?
the Clinton, I'm sorry,
Obama.
I'm sorry, I meant Clinton administration. And so we felt that in 1995 it was best to open up this document for discussion among governments, because at the end of the day the governments would have to come together to actually create this treaty. And that's So we used that as the template for starting the process, which ultimately became the Rome Statute.
95, when you were looking at this, having had at least within earshot of Robert Rosenstock, would you guess at that time that you may find yourself in a treaty mode with the United States?
Oh yes, yeah.
In 95, you felt
oh, yeah.
fairly good about
Oh
that.
yeah, oh yeah. Even with kind of reasonable Pentagon support at that time,
Mhm.
the question was, would the final treaty be shaped in such a way that met our most basic requirements for such a treaty? But President Clinton on 6 separate occasions while he was president publicly said that he wanted a permanent international criminal court, and he wanted it built by the end of this century, the 20th century. So, those were my marching orders from the president. And the real issue as the years went by was not should there or should there not be an ICC. It was rather, what is the final structure of this court? How do cases ultimately come before this court? What are the triggers for that? And that's where the process bogged down within the U.S. federal government, because not only on the executive branch side, but also on the congressional side, voices started to question, what is the final shape of this court? What will it look like?
So during that 3-year time period, 95 to ultimately 98, when decisions had to be made, were you intimately involved? Was that your
Yes.
role?
Yeah.
And at some point you gathered together in Rome to sort of
Well, ultimately,
How-
ultimately these negotiations, which were all supervised by the United Nations, the decision was made in 1997 to convene in Rome in 1998
Okay.
to finalize the treaty text.
Mhm.
So it was an international decision to do so, and the United States joined that decision in 1997 to get to Rome by the summer of 1998. So it was very much anticipated that the summer of 1998 would be the end point of the negotiations on the basic statute of the court.
during that year period when timelines are starting to turn over the sand clock of time, and you've got to start. Did you get a sense that this could be pushed into the end zone? 97.
Yes, there were moments of that character. As I describe in my book, as a negotiator, I kept sort of presenting options to Washington as to how can we influence these negotiations in order to get to a point that is acceptable to the United States government. And, some of my suggestions were not accepted back in Washington. There was sort of a digging in, particularly by the Pentagon on some of these issues. And even in the book, I note that right up to the final weeks before we went to Rome, I was trying to get a change in instructions approved by the principals, which would include the president, so that I could go to Rome with shall we say, a more workable set of instructions to achieve closure on this treaty in the interests of the United States. And I was not able to get those instructions altered before I left for Rome. In other words, they remained the standing instructions of several years of negotiations. And that was a real setback, because I needed that flexibility in order to maneuver at Rome. I needed some flexibility to do that, and I didn't have that flexibility.
When you say you needed instructions, what form does that take? Is that a memo, a letter, a generic?
No, typically it will. Well, it could ultimately it can be the form of a memo, for example, from some higher level of the U.S. government to me.
The executive?
For example, the National Security Council
Okay.
could simply issue a decision by the National Security Council which sets forth my instructions. That would be a National Security Council document. But basically what happens is they transform that into a cable of instructions out of the State Department to me. So I actually work with cabled instructions
Gotcha.
when I go overseas, copied, to relevant embassies that we have, etc. So that everyone knows what my instructions are. At least within a small circle of U.S. government officials, they know what my instructions are.
Right.
We don't broadcast the instructions to other governments, because I go into the negotiating room knowing what my colleagues back in Washington want me to achieve in that negotiating room.
How difficult is it when you kind of sort of would like to have had different instructions?
Well, it is difficult. I write about this in the book, that
Right.
of course I wanted a different set of instructions because I really thought we could prevail and protect American interests in the process. So it was difficult because I had to keep going into every meeting in Rome stating what everyone knew was our old position, and trying to find sort of new avenues of achieving that when other countries had moved far beyond that point in the discussion, far beyond it. And they were innovating and getting sort of rapid fire decisions made in their capitals every day to allow them to tack through the negotiations. We still, at least at that time, I can't speak to today, but at least at that time in the late 1990s, we still had a process within the State Department and within the federal government where it was very difficult to get decisions made that enabled negotiators to flexibly work the issue day after day in the negotiations. What you need is sort of a war room back in Washington where the negotiator calls back in and says, this is what I'm confronted with today, but also these are the opportunities I see today. I need the authority to press this issue beyond this boundary. I need the authority to promise the following to this government as a concession in order to get their support for our position. So you sort of need that constant process back in Washington so that you're not operating off brief, but you're operating as effectively as possible. Now, some governments had that in Rome, where they literally, at any hour of day and night, could call back to the foreign ministry and get a decision made. They had figured it out. And we simply did not have that process in place.
During that time period, the whole Lewinsky scandal breaks. As you're kind of out there trying to negotiate, are you getting anybody's attention since that's happening?
I think in the end it was a problem. I think it degraded our ability in Washington to conduct foreign policy. I think it had a negative effect on the ability of policymakers, particularly in the White House, to focus at the right time and make tough decisions at the right time. Now, someone might say, oh no, in rebuttal, we were doing everything perfectly in the White House at the time. I don't believe that.
Mm-hmm.
I could see that it was degrading the process. You weren't able to get decisions out of the president quickly, etc. And so it was a very, very tough impact on American governance, that scandal, and that persisted through to the end of 1998 with the impeachment trials, etc. A tremendous diversion of attention to that process as opposed to actually governing both foreign policy as well as domestic policy at the time. So an unfortunate thing, and I think it really undercut my ability to achieve our objectives in Rome. I'm not trying to blame other people. I really am not. I'm just trying to say that I had a certain set of instructions. I needed to move smartly with those instructions, and I needed efficient, smart responses in Washington, click, 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 throughout this process. And that was not being achieved.
So the time is clicking away here, and they're ready to take votes. Did you ever get any sense as you were getting closer to the bewitching hour that you might get a break from Washington?
Well, I thought we had a good shot at it, even in the final week, when something I write about in the book called the Wednesday Compromise was achieved with the other four permanent members of the Security Council. And we all reached consensus on how to deal with essentially the sort of the transition period for major powers to embrace this court. A formula that would allow genocide as a subject matter to go forward, and to give nations that sign up to the statute a 10-year period to opt out of crimes against humanity and war crimes. But at the end of that 10 years, that opt-out was no longer available. So it was a transition concept. Washington signed off on this, and the Pentagon signed off on it. That was actually a big breakthrough for me. The problem is it came too late. Mm-hmm. It's simply too late at that point to go back to scores and scores of other governments that have committed themselves to a different pathway for this court and say, look, the heavies have agreed on a different formula. Now, please come along and adopt our formula, the Security Council formula, of the Security Council permanent members formula. And the reality is that there are many, many governments in the world that have considerable difficulty with the whole concept of the power that the Security Council has under the UN Charter. So to tell them that this is something the permanent members are backing doesn't necessarily win you a lot of friends. Mm-hmm. And so that is the dilemma we confronted. And sure enough, within a day, the vast number of other countries negotiating the treaty rejected the Wednesday Compromise. And when that rejection came in, I knew that this was probably going to be the end of it for the United States in terms of being able to support this final draft of the treaty.
How difficult is it personally when you get the Ben Ferentzes and the Whitney Harrises and those guys, sort of, you see them, they're floating around, NGOs, and you really have a script that you can only work off of, and they'd say, David, you need to do this, David, why don't you consider that, David. How do you deal with that?
Well, first of all, you got to have thick skin. But secondly, it's one of the great ironies of our international system in that the United States has a very activist, non-governmental organization movement, and they were extremely active and effective in Rome in the summer of 1998. So that, quite frankly, you have the United States being presented through the NGO prism of really admirable vision and allegiance to the values of the rule of law that we all want to be faithful to, and they're pressing that agenda. Meanwhile, I'm representing the U.S. government, which has lots of different equities at stake, including national security and the interests of our military, etc., and also the members of Congress. And I, of course, have to follow that second track, being always respectful and mindful of what my NGOs are saying to me, but that doesn't mean that they can literally dictate U.S. policy. It's a process. But it was in terms of pressing the U.S. position, it was quite crippling at times. For example, when the Wednesday Compromise came out, the NGOs were totally opposed to it. So here they are going off to all these other governments telling them do not accept the Wednesday Compromise. And that, of course, resonated with these other governments. They're listening to all these American NGOs telling them, don't accept the Wednesday Compromise. And that is, that's just not very helpful.
When the day is done, the vote is taken, did you vote no or did you just abstain?
No, we voted no, and that was a big issue. Washington wanted a vote called. Now, normally what happens is that you just adopt the final text of the treaty by voice vote consensus. You don't have a recorded vote where countries have to vote yay or nay.
Yeah.
You just do it by a voice vote, and without objections being raised. That is what I had recommended by phone to Washington, because there was no way we were going to win this vote. I mean, we were going to lose this vote in spades.
Right.
So why position the United States in such a posture of being on very much the losing side on a recorded vote? Why not just do as many other countries who were not satisfied with the final statute, let the statute go through, and then voice publicly a statement of problems with the statute, saying, well, this is interesting, but for the United States to sign this statute or even ultimately ratify it, there are several problems that will have to be resolved. And other governments got up and said those kinds of things. They abstained, and then they made their comments. But nonetheless, I had to call for a vote, which I did, and although it was really a vote of no action presented by Norway, which was the real vote. And unfortunately, the United States, was joined by rogue nations in this vote, as well as our ally Israel. But to say that Syria and Libya and Iraq and Cuba were somehow the ones we wanted to be associated with is not necessarily what you look for in terms of those who vote no. Can't remember whether Cuba was in that group, but nonetheless, it was not a group that we were particularly excited to be associated with. So that was unfortunate, and of course we got tarred and feathered for years after for being part of this small group of otherwise rogue nations voting against the Rome Statute. Now 2 years later, 2.5 years later, after supplemental documents, the rules of procedure and evidence, and the elements of crimes had been negotiated, and I'd been part of those negotiations, we had accepted those documents by consensus, the U.S. government. I then ultimately signed the Rome Statute on behalf of the U.S. government and President Clinton. So we ultimately got to the point of actually embracing the Rome Statute at the very end of the Clinton administration. But of course there were tough days ahead in the George W. Bush administration for that decision, when ultimately the United States in 2002, May of 2002, sent a letter essentially trying to nullify my signature.
Did you get a sense, at least what some of the press said, was just sort of keeping it in play? You signed it December 31st or whatever time it was.
2000, yeah.
Yeah, 2000, just to kind of keep it alive for the discussion purposes, or was it, did you get a sense that at some point this could in fact become a discussion point in the Congress?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, that was this was a big decision the president made. He
Right.
didn't make some frivolous decision here. He spent days up at Camp David reviewing this whole situation, and finally the decision was, let's sign it. Let's show our support for this concept of a international criminal court. We obviously have to caveat our signing by saying that we would still like to see certain provisions modified in the future, and that until some of those issues are resolved, it's simply not plausible to talk about ratifying the treaty. But this is a process. So it was really a process moment. We sign it, we gain the credibility of being a signatory. That gives us more clout in the further negotiations that still were taking place on all sorts of supplemental documents to the treaty that were of great importance. And and to have that credibility of being a signatory state would hopefully make a difference as we work these issues with other governments, as opposed to being an outlier, as other governments are rushing towards the Rome Statute, were we supposed to rush away from it, be an outlier, and then turn our head back to them and say, oh, by the way, now we want to persuade you to make the changes here that we want you to make. Well, no, that doesn't quite work in the world of diplomacy. You have to be in the room. You have to show the respect to the process and not be, shall we say, a whiner or crybaby and keep running away from things. So we were prepared to continue to engage, and to engage as a signatory state to achieve those final modifications that we needed. And a lot of that could be done without amending the statute itself. And those proposals had all been lined up in the year 2000 by me in the negotiations. They were primed for consideration in 2001 with the United States, asking nations to consider these particular issues. And frankly, I had gotten a lot of support for that from other countries. But when you lose the election and you have to step aside because the new administration comes in, we lost our advantage to do that. We had hoped that the Bush administration would pick it up and run with it because it was in U.S. interest to do so. But they did not. They abandoned the seat. I was the last one to sit in the seat until diplomats from the Obama administration sat in those seats again in the year 2009.
Did you get when you left Rome? I'm sure you weren't a happy camper, and get back, and during that time period of until December of that year, did you have much? Did you feel like you had an influence on changing at least the perspective of what it is that you were trying to accomplish? Yeah. So did you actually got to talk to somebody?
Those were some of the toughest months of my ambassadorship. In fact, maybe they were the toughest, at least within the Washington environment, because I had failed to achieve our objectives, our ultimate objectives in Rome in terms of the Rome Statute, and I did not have much support at all by others in the government to pursue the project of the ICC. So I had to sort of start from scratch to persuade others that, look, we need to re-engage now. There are years of negotiations still ahead on the supplemental documents for the International Criminal Court. It'll be years before there are 60 ratifications to activate this court. It proved to be 4 years, much shorter than I thought, but still years ahead. We need to engage to ensure that our interests are not only heard but protected in the process as it goes forward. And it took about 5 months to turn away almost a universally negative point of view about the court, even among my colleagues in the government, who had been so much a part of the process getting to Rome, to turn them around and say, okay, Ambassador Scheffer can return to the negotiations in February of 1998 with a delegation, an interagency delegation, in order to work these issues and to stay engaged. But that was a very tough fight internally for 5 months. I heard far more no's than yeses. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, just essentially dogging the issue every day, I was able to obtain the approval to actually proceed again. And that process then ultimately culminated with signing the Rome Statute on December 31st. If we had not gone through that process in late 1998 of deciding to re-engage, we never would have gotten to a signature posture by December 31st of 2000, ever.
Now, Clinton had lost the election, the Democrats had lost
Yes.
the election at that point. Did you have any real sense that maybe Bush would pick up on it? Did anybody in the Republican counterpart?
There was of course we knew that there were elements in the Republican Party on the Hill that had no interest in pursuing this, particularly Senator Helms, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. But we actually held out hope that we were giving George W. Bush on a golden platter, essentially,
Mm-hmm.
the opportunity to better protect U.S. interests as the months and years went by with respect to the ICC. In other words, we're a signatory state under this plan. Here are the initiatives that still need to be taken to protect these equities that we've been talking about for so long, mostly protecting the U.S. military and its global deployments. Now go back into the negotiating room and achieve these objectives, which are in the U.S. interest to achieve, regardless of political party. We're talking about national security here. And so, yeah, we honestly thought, let's sign this, let's give this to him so that he has the legitimacy of being a signatory state. Of course, they saw it very differently ultimately in the Bush administration. They saw this as a toxic signature because they didn't want to be associated at all with this court. And they had very conservative individuals joining the administration who had always opposed this court, had been in debates with me, you know, when they were in the loyal opposition. And so, you know, they made of it what they did, and ultimately a year and a half later, in May of 2002, they decided to very publicly seek to nullify my signature. Now, my signature is still on the statute, the Rome Treaty, and basically all that's required at this stage is that President Obama or someone from the senior level of the State Department would need to send a letter to the United Nations, which is the depository institution for the treaty, and simply say that the letter sent in May of 2002 by the Bush administration is hereby revoked, and we resume our full signatory status and all of the rights and obligations we have as a signatory state. That's all that's required. And what the UN would then do is they would always show the Bush letter of May 2002 as the first asterisk to our name. And then there would be two asterisks which would show the current administration's letter nullifying the first letter. So they would just show that as a historical record with respect to the signature of the United States.
Any chance Steve Rapp can convince Barack Obama to do that?
Well, one would hope so. It's just that it's probably seen as a unnecessarily provocative move to do so. In other words, it would anger the conservative factions unnecessarily is probably the argument. But I would hope that if there's an opportunity for another Obama administration, that sometime within that 4-year period there is a decision to send that very simple one-paragraph letter to the United Nations.
And then the process then would go to Congress for ratification?
Well, ultimately, one would hope so.
Yeah.
There's been a lot of thinking about what would be required for that to happen, and a considerable amount of preparatory steps would be required before I think the Senate would take it seriously enough to actually move it along in the calendar. But it's a very tough road in the U.S. Senate. I mean, after all, ever since 1996, we've been attempting to ratify the Law of the Sea Convention, and every president has supported that, Republican and Democrat, and it still has not happened in the U.S. Senate.
Do you ever sit back like here today and say, wow, I've really been involved in a hell of a lot of things, and yet you're a pretty young guy?
Well, yeah, I do think about it sometimes, but I'm very engaged now again in the work of one particular war crimes tribunal, and you just never forget what you've witnessed and what has been the pain of the victims and the colossal size of these crimes, and you just hope that in your own lifetime you can make some sort of difference and so many people now in the last 18 years have been able to make that difference with respect to the work of these war crimes tribunals. And we all stand on the shoulders of Robert Jackson in doing this, because he truly was someone who helped launch this process way back after World War II. I hope I still have many years to go.
You do, and certainly will. You're an amazing guy. This has been fun. I've been trying to do this for 6 years, David, to have a
Really?
chance. Yeah.
Oh.
You don't know that, but it just your schedules, my schedules,
Yeah.
whatever happened to be. And I'm just thrilled we had a moment in time here where we could get you and a little bit of the story of Ambassador Scheffer. This is great.
Well, I appreciate that. It's very enjoyable. This whole event, the International Humanitarian Law Dialogue, is kind of a pleasure to look forward to every year, because it really does bring so many interesting people together. And we all talk about our pet project, which is atrocity crimes and the tribunals that prosecute them. And so that's a worthwhile endeavor, I think.
What's interesting, what Sharif said last night, that one, it's a small fraternity of people. It's two, a lonely fraternity. And three, we don't have much time to really recharge the batteries.
And the loneliness is actually very apt. When we get out of these circles of our own kind, the knowledge gap is amazing out there. They say, what? A war crimes tribunal? What happened? There's a permanent court? What's that? So it's very much there's a huge challenge out there to try to communicate why this all happened and why it is happening. And it is one of the reasons I wrote the book. I wanted to write the book to appeal not only to the legal academy, but also to a broader readership. And hopefully it has a few legs by which to do so.
Have you taken? I'm a visual guy. And have you paused, and you certainly have had snippets of yourself and other things which were tipping points in the book. Have you decided to pull those newsreels and do a sort of a David Scheffer highlight film?
I had there was a movie producer for the movie The Reckoning about the International Criminal Court who wanted to capture some of me on film while I was ambassador. So I had saved lots of video snippets of me, some of which, of course, back in the 90s, were on these big videotapes.
Beta, yeah.
Beta and all that stuff. It was amazing. But I kept them all in a box.
Yeah,
It was just classic. It was down in the basement. It was just a box in a basement, And the producer said, "Oh, well, can I have that box?" And I said, "Well, what do you want to do with it?" And she said, "Oh, no, you'll get it all back. But what I want to do is we're going to put it all on DVD so that we can easily work with it." And she did. And now I have all of that on DVD sort of preserves some of what I did, at least in terms of video coverage. Yeah, it's an interesting, it's a very, I think, sort of dynamic story of diplomacy and law, and also the reality of what was occurring in the field itself, the atrocities. And so, who knows what might unfold from it someday. But,
well, I mean, as I read it, I could visualize all the things, even the Lewinsky thing. All of a sudden, you get the clip, and you're out there, and you're frustrated, you're struggling, and you got guys. Even I'm sure there are clips of Ben Ferentz saying, the U.S.
well, I tell you,
you can create this.
I will only say very cavalierly, but truthfully, actually, yes, there's a story there, and I've had people approach me regarding how this would look on film, so who knows what will happen in the future.
Well, Yeah, it is part of the history, and if there's, an interest in things like the reckoning, and process, this clearly is still an issue. The question that will always come up: why isn't the United States a signatory to the Rome Treaty? And, that's boom, you lay it out there. And in conferences like this, it's almost ridiculous to ask, because they all will conclude, yes, that we should,
Yeah,
because we don't have the counterpoint that
exactly.
they're not in the field.
Yeah.
By design, they're not in the field, but they're not in the field. So it's easy question, easy answer. Someday we might.
Yeah.
And I guess the other piece of it, and we now know how to abstain when there is a resolution which might cause us to otherwise have a referral to the ICC.
Yeah, I would hope so. I would hope we know sort of the wisdom of how to abstain rather than unnecessarily unleash the dogs of opposition against the United States when it's really not necessary,
Right.
because we all believe essentially in the same goal of rule of law and of bringing perpetrators of atrocity crimes to justice. So why complicate that goal, that mission, with sort of an unnecessary diplomatic slap in the face of everyone else by saying, well, no, we can't be associated with you on this. No, be associated, but of course state your objections and your concerns. That's part of the process. That's diplomacy. That is the international system. Being an outlier does not achieve your objectives anymore. It just doesn't. It's a very interconnected, integrated world. And being an outlier is, it's not wise for a great power to be one. You attract unnecessary, debilitating opposition from that vantage point. So my suggestion is engage, but engage very, very smartly.
Mm-hmm. What have you missed in here? Everybody writes a book and they say,
Oh, sure. I can tell you there's a lot missed in my book. I did not write, and this is just because the editor said, look, I submitted a manuscript of 250,000 words, and the editor said, oh, thanks very much. Over the next few weeks, we'll look forward to you cutting 60,000 words from your manuscript, because we can, to publish a book at that price, you have to bring it down to about 190,000 words. Otherwise, you're jacking up the price of your book. It becomes that thick instead of that thick, and the publisher doesn't want to go in that direction. So I had to cut 60,000 words, and I'm creating a second book out of that 60,000 words now. So that'll you'll see that arrive. But what is not even included in the 60,000 words is the tribunals that I tried to create but failed to do so. And that's a whole story in and of itself. These are simply the tribunals that I succeeded in helping with the creation of. We were not successful in creating a war crimes tribunal on Iraq. Now remember, this is Iraq of the 1980s and 1990s. It has nothing to do with the George W. Bush world. It has to do with the Gulf War of 1990, 91, but it also has to do with what Saddam Hussein unleashed on his people for 20 years. We had a very concerted effort to try to build that tribunal, and that story isn't told at all in my book. We had an effort with Chechnya, believe it or not. We had an effort with Sudan and the 17-year civil war in Sudan. And we had an effort with Burundi and the genocide that actually took place in Burundi. All of those are stories that really have never been told, and which are the tribunals that were never built. And so I sometimes sit back and say, would anyone buy a book entitled The Tribunals We Never Built? But each of them are diplomatic stories of how the obstacles arose time and again to actually achieve accountability in those situations.
Wow, this is great, David. Thank
So,
you. Thanks
thank
for
you very
coming,
much.
and we look forward to next year.
Yeah, exactly. Next year. Okay, appreciate it.